Welcome, and thank you for joining us this evening for the penultimate event in our fall programming series, Freedom and Captivity. The series is co-organized by Catherine Besteman, Professor of Anthropology, Chandra Bimal, Chair of the African American Studies Department and Professor of Anthropology, and myself, Gwen Shanks, in the Theater and Dance Department. I want to begin by acknowledging that I am located on territory stewarded by the Wabanaki Confederacy. We recognize and honor the current tribes who comprise the Confederacy, the Penobscot, Palmsquoddy, Maliseet, and Micmac peoples. We recognize and support their efforts for land and water protection and restoration, and for cultural healing and recovery in the wake of ongoing settler colonialism. We also recognize that statements such as these are gestures that find efficacy only when linked with material support, care, solidarity, and action. Freedom and Captivity, supported by the Center for Arts and Humanities at Colby College, explores a set of interrelated questions. What does it mean to be free? What forms can liberation take? And how do we articulate and enact an abolitionist vision now? Tonight, we are joined by freelance journalist and author Victoria Law, whose work focuses on the intersections of mass incarceration, gender, and resistance. From her integral engagement with the Hub for Art and Activism, ABC No Rio in the Lower East Side, to her writing, Law's work imagines and enacts the conditions for community and compassion while challenging the racist carceral state's structures of violence and social death. Her books include Resistance Behind Bars, The Struggles of Incarcerated Women, Prison by Any Other Name, The Harmful Consequences of Popular Reform, co-written with Maya Chenoir, and Prisons Make Us Safer, and 20 Other Myths About Mass Incarceration. Her writing has likewise appeared in outlets like the New York Times, The Nation, and Miss Magazine. Following Law's talk, we'll come back together to answer questions from the audience. Throughout the program this evening, please feel free to ask questions in the Q&A box. Finally, before we begin, I want to thank all of the departments and programs across campus who have offered support for this series, and to the Black School for their beautiful graphics, which you see on this opening slide. It is our very great pleasure to welcome Victoria Law.
Thank you so much, Gwyneth. And thank you, Colby, for having me. Thank you, everybody, for giving up part of your evening to come and be part of this series. I'm going to start with a story that illustrates gender violence, criminalization, and the failure of policing and prisons to keep women and girls safe. I will warn you that while I will not be explicit, there will be mention of physical and sexual violence in my talk. So do what you need to do to take care of yourself. If you need to temporarily walk away and come back, that is fine. Again, do what you need to do when encountering talk about physical and sexual violence. So I'm going to start with a story from July 2016 in Warren, Ohio. There was a 14-year-old girl named Risha Meadows who that month was arrested for shooting and killing her father. Her father had terrorized her and her family for her entire childhood. For the entirety of her childhood, Risha had watched as her father punched, kicked, stomped, and beat her mother, Brandy. Her father threatened to kill Brandy, his wife, Risha's mother, and their 3 children if she ever tried to leave him. Risha's father had put his wife in the hospital over 15 times. In 2011, when Risha was 9 years old, Brandy did attempt to leave. She moved out of the house with her children and filed an order of protection after her husband broke her ribs, her fingers, and the blood vessels in her hands. He found her, and then he apologized. He promised to change, promised not to do it again, and she returned. Now, before you think, well, what is this? For those of you not familiar with domestic violence, This is not unusual. It takes between 7 to 10 times for a person to leave an abusive relationship. Remember that domestic and family violence is a tangled ball of love, care, and harm. It is not just all harm and violence. But when Brandy and the children came back, her husband subjected her to even tighter controls. This included having to wake him up at night before she even left the bed to use the bathroom. He also began sexually abusing Brescia, who was the youngest child. In January of 2015, Brescia was 13 years old, and she ran away to her aunt's house. Her father called the police, and he accused his sisters-in-law of kidnapping. Brescia was returned to the home, and one of her aunts, who was a police officer in the domestic violence unit in Cleveland, a neighboring city, asked the local police to perform what's known as wellness checks, in which police are supposed to come by somebody's house and make sure everyone is okay. Instead of just coming by and saying, "Hi, is everything okay? We just wanted to make sure everybody's doing fine," they would stop by the house and they would tell Brescia's father that his sister-in-law had asked them to check on him. As you can imagine, this did not go over well. And the abuse not only continued, but because Brescia had run away, it got even worse. During this time, Brescia's grades began to fall, but no one in the school system took notice enough to find out what was going on at home. The next year, Brescia ran away again. This time, her aunt called the Department of Family Services, but social workers came to the house and interviewed Brescia's parents together. And Brescia's mother, Brandy, later asked, "What can I say to this lady when my husband is sitting right next to me?" And just like with the police, nothing ever came of the complaint except for an escalation of the violence. Finally, that July, Brescia shot and killed her father with the same gun that he had used to terrorize his family. She was arrested. The prosecutors deliberated charging her as an adult, which meant that if this 14-year-old girl was convicted of murder, she would have spent the rest of her life in prison. And that didn't happen, not because the prosecutors had a change of heart in a vacuum, but because there was an outpouring of support, including activist and organizer support, media attention, and a flurry of letters and calls to the prosecutor. And this meant that the prosecutors first decided to charge her as a child, meaning that even if she were convicted or found guilty, she would only be imprisoned until the age of 21, not for the rest of her life. And then finally, after much more pressure and much more organizing, they agreed to a plea bargain in which she pled true, which is the juvenile equivalent of guilty, and sentenced to a year and a day in juvenile jail, which included the 9 months she had previously spent behind bars, plus 6 months in mental health treatment and 2 years of probation. This meant that Brescia spent her 15th and 16th birthdays, plus all of the Christmases and Thanksgivings and other holidays behind bars away from her family. She was released from the treatment center in February of 2018. And today, she's a college student and an organizer. But she was able to do this in spite of the criminal legal system, not because that system protected her. And I start with that story so that we can see how relying on policing, prosecution, and imprisonment doesn't necessarily stop gender violence, and at times can worsen an abusive or violent situation. I also tell that story so that we can look at all of the other systems that failed Brescia and her family throughout the years. Many of you already know this, but Brescia's example really highlights this. Now, keep in mind that we don't know the number of abuse survivors of any gender and of any age group currently incarcerated for similar acts of self-defense. There are no national statistics on this. So I'm going to start by putting out and defining a few terms. The first one is carceral feminism. And it's a term that's often used to describe a reliance on increased policing, prosecution, and imprisonment as the primary solution to gender-based violence, whether that violence is sexual assault, sexual abuse, or domestic violence. And relying on policing, and prisons ignores the ways in which intersecting identities such as race, class, gender identity, and immigration status leaves certain people more vulnerable to violence, including state violence. And it also ignores the ways that the state and systems continually fail to protect marginalized people, including women of color, trans and gender nonconforming people, queer people, poor people, and immigrants. We see this in the case of Risha Meadows, who is Black, and her family, which was low income. And as we go through tonight, ask yourselves, what were the ways in which state systems could have intervened, but did not, in all those years that she and her family were being terrorized by her father? Now, we're also seeing, at the same time that we see a heightened reliance on policing and imprisonment as a supposed solution to violence against women, we also see a massive increase in women's incarceration. In 1970, there were 5,600 women in jails and prisons across the nation. By 1980, that number had nearly quintupled to 25,450 women. 10 years later, in 1990, there were nearly 78,000 women. And these are people whom the state identifies as women. This does not include trans women in men's jails or prisons, or women in immigrant detention, or girls in youth jails. As of 2019, jails and prisons incarcerate nearly 223,000 women. So we go from 5,600 in 1970 to 223,000 as of 2 years ago. And this is not necessarily happening in a vacuum. It is because criminalization has become the go-to for all sorts of societal shortcomings and failures to support people. And at the same time, what we're seeing is that this disproportionately lands on marginalized people. So for instance, we know that Black women are more than 1.7 times more likely to be incarcerated than white women. They're also more than twice as likely to be abused and murdered by abusive partners than white women. So we can see the ways in which this buildup of incarceration has not protected them from gender-based violence. And what we see is that this buildup of women's incarceration happens because of many of the same factors as the buildup of men's incarceration, such as racism and racial profiling, in which African Americans and Latinx people are 3 times more likely than whites to be searched, arrested, threatened, or subdued with force when stopped by police. And white people who enter the criminal legal system are more likely to end up being offered alternatives to incarceration than people of color counterparts. And when you add the ways in which society condones gender violence and encourages gender violence, we also see that this disproportionately affects women who end up in the jail and prison system. At least half of incarcerated women reported that they had survived violence even before being arrested. And when it comes to girls, that is women or girls under the age of 18, 84% of girls in the juvenile justice system have experienced past abuse. Now, you might ask, well, don't prisons keep us safe from rape and sexual abuse? And when we think about what happened to Risha, we think about what happened to all other survivors, so many of whom have not come forward, or many of whom say, I came forward and nobody believed me, or I came forward and nothing happened. I came forward, but even if this person was prosecuted, I was not, it did not change the fact that I had been sexually assaulted or sexually abused. We can say, no, prisons themselves don't keep us safe from rape and sexual abuse. According to the Department of Justice's own statistics, of every 1,000 sexual assaults, only 230, or less than 1/4, are ever reported to the police. In other words, every year, 3 of 4 sexual assaults go unreported. And from there, the numbers get even smaller. Of those 230 sexual assaults that are reported to the police, only 46 of those reports, or about 20%, lead to an arrest. Of those 46 arrests, only 9 are referred to prosecutors, and only 5 ultimately result in a felony conviction. And of those 5, fewer than 5 people convicted of rape are actually incarcerated. So when you think about the question of whether or not we need prisons, policing, and prosecution to keep us safe from sexual abuse and sexual assault, we should keep those very, very small and winnowing numbers in mind. We should also keep in mind that policing, prosecution, and imprisonment typically happens after harm has occurred, if it happens at all. It does not necessarily prevent harm from happening in the first place. Numbers for child sexual abuse are even smaller than what I just talked about, which is for adult sexual abuse and sexual assault. So for every 100 incidents of child sexual abuse, only 10 to 18 are ever reported to authorities. So that is a hugely small percentage. And of those, only 6 go to trial. And of those 6 that go to trial, only 3 incidents result in a conviction for something. And that something may not be what they are accused of. It might be that the person plea bargained to a lesser charge. For those of you unfamiliar with plea bargaining, it is when you are being charged with something that is usually something with a very high sentence or a very problematic outcome, such as sexual assault or sexual abuse, but you might plead down to say something like burglary or neglect or robbery, something that would make it so that you do not have to face the full ramifications of going to trial and being convicted of some draconian crime. And 90 to 97% of all convictions in the United States, regardless of the charge, are the result of plea bargains. So plea bargains are the rule, not the exception. So of every 100 incidents of child sexual abuse, only 3 are convicted of something, and that something might be an act or a criminalized action for which the person plea bargained down for, not necessarily them admitting that they sexually abused or sexually assaulted a child. In addition, we don't know how many instances of sexual assault and abuse occur at the hands of law enforcement. No official organization keeps track of these numbers. A few years ago, the Associated Press found that during a 6-year period, roughly 1,000 police officers lost their badges for rape, sodomy, sexual misconduct, meaning that they propositioned people or had child pornography. And this meant that every other day within that 6-year time period, a police officer lost his badge. And what is also frightening is what the Associated Press concluded about these findings. And they said, the number is unquestionably an undercount because it represents only those officers whose licenses to work in law enforcement were revoked. And not all states take such action. California and New York, with several of the nation's largest law enforcement agencies, offered no records because they have no statewide system to decertify officers for misconduct. And even among states that provided records, some reported no officers removed for sexual misdeeds, even though cases were identified via news stories or court records. It's happening probably in every law enforcement agency across the country, said Chief Bernadette DePino of the Sarasota Police Department in Florida, who helped study the problem for the International Association of Chiefs of Police. It's so underreported, and people are scared that if they call and complain about a police officer, they think every other police officer is going to then be out to get them. In other words, we know about these 1,000 officers who lost their badges only because they lost their badges. In many instances, this happened because one or more of the people that they had abused had the courage to file complaints despite the very real threat of repercussions. And then someone in a position of authority took their accusations seriously enough to investigate. What about all the people who felt that they couldn't risk speaking up because the person who abused them was a police officer? As I've talked about a few minutes ago, we see that the majority of people don't report sexual assault or sexual abuse. And when they do, very few of those complaints are taken seriously. Now, you might ask, how did we get to this point where we rely on the same systems that lock up girls and women to supposedly protect them? So we'll go back to 1994, when Congress passed the Violence Against Women Act, known as VAWA, which pushed police to respond to complaints about domestic violence, sexual assault, and other gender-based violence. And this was something that was pushed for by many women who were tired of police being called and not responding and not addressing domestic violence or sexual assault. And what happened was that in many jurisdictions, VAWA resulted in mandatory arrest laws, meaning that if the police were called about a domestic violence incident, they had to arrest somebody. It also resulted in more punitive prison sentences. Now you might ask, well, what's wrong with that? But with mandatory arrest laws, it was still up to the police officer's discretion who to arrest. So if they showed up at a home in which the person who was abusive seems more calm and rational than the person who has just been abused, who is crying or screaming or wanting something to be done, they might end up arresting that person. Or they might end up arresting both people, a policy known as dual arrests, in which both people are arrested and they allow the legal system to sort it out later. It also meant that the more punitive prison sentences meant that people who did not want an abusive partner to necessarily go to prison for long periods of time, or even to go to jail for short periods of time because they were economically dependent on them, or they relied on them for childcare, or they simply did not want to see them locked up, but they wanted the violence to stop, would be more reluctant to call the police or to tell the police what had happened if the police showed up. In addition, some places began jailing victims as material witnesses and imposing fines and threatening them with arrests if they did not cooperate with prosecution. And very importantly, what this legislation did was it provided $30 billion for 100,000 new police officers and $9.7 billion for more prisons. It provided only a fraction of that amount of funding for other types of support that could allow people to safely escape abusive relationships and be able to rebuild their lives, such as affordable and accessible and safe housing, such as affordable childcare or even free childcare, such as accessible and affordable medical and mental health care for people who needed it. All of these things have been shown to enable people to to escape abusive relationships and rebuild their lives more than simply putting a carceral approach to domestic and sexual violence. And at the same time, it also criminalized immigrants, because immigrants who experience domestic violence or sexual assault can apply for relief under the Violence Against Women Act. Those who have criminal convictions cannot and are thus subject to deportation. And again, remember that the majority of people who are identified as women and girls, as well as those who identify as women and girls in jails and prisons, have previously experienced violence, often at the hands of their loved ones. And again, we don't know how many people are imprisoned because of domestic or sexual violence, whether it's defending themselves and their families, like Brescia Meadows did, or because they were coerced into participating in criminal activity by their abusive partners, which is a story that I come across again and again and again. but there are many abuse survivors in prison, and they and their stories and the injustices that happen to them are often ignored by the same individuals and organizations that advocate for these carceral solutions. I'm going to pause here for a second and let you take that in before we move into some other approaches that could be and are being utilized by other places, and in some instances, perhaps close to where you are or where you are, depending on where you live, to address violence, particularly sexual and gendered violence. So if we were sitting in the same room, I would ask you all, how many of you have heard of restorative justice? It's a term that has gotten more and more recognized and acknowledged these days as a potential alternative to the system of prosecuting and imprisoning people. And restorative justice is a process that involves, to the extent possible, everyone who has a stake in a specific offense, and to collectively identify and address the harms that happened and the needs and obligations of both the person or the people who are harmed, and in order to heal and put things as right as possible. Now that might seem very broad and very vague, but what in reality this means is that often victims come together with those who have caused harm to them, but they do so alongside other people in the community who may have also been affected. So instead of it just being me and Gwyneth sitting in a room talking about how I have wronged Gwyneth because I broke her car window and stole her radio, it might be Gwyneth and I sitting down with other people, like maybe her mother, who says, you know, you broke her car window, you stole her radio. Now I worry because, you know, that's never happened to her before. And as a mother, I worry about these things. Maybe it is her children who are like, hey, you know, like it really frightens us that you did this because, you know, it makes us realize that the world is not a safe place and that even people who are your supposed friends will do these things to you. Or it might be Gwyneth herself who says, you broke my window and I can't drive around with a broken window. So therefore I have to go spend a lot of money to get my that I cannot afford to take my car in to fix my window. It's a very simplistic explanation of restorative justice, but I wanted to show how people can be brought into this process. And it sometimes has a ripple effect on other people in the community, not just the person who did the harm and the person who was harmed. And in restorative justice, often instead of punishment being doled out from a judge or an authority figure on high who does not know the people and is supposedly impartial, the participants themselves try to move towards an agreement on how to address the situation, including how the victim or survivor will be supported in their healing and how the person who did the harm will be held accountable. And I want to give an example, which is a very stark example. And again, there is a trigger warning for mentions of sexual violence in this example that happened at Hollow Water, an Ojibwe reserve north of Winnipeg in Canada. At Hollow Water, about 2/3 of their 450 residents have experienced sexual abuse at the hands of family members. And at the same time, Hollow Water residents understood that relying on the traditional criminal legal system requires children to testify against their abusive loved ones, and to do so in a way that convinced others that they were telling the truth. Now, you can imagine that this is terrifying and terrible for any child to be abused by someone who says that they love them and whom they love. And then for them to have to testify against that abusive loved one, and to know that in doing so, they're sending their loved one off to go be punished. And to have to do so again and again and again so that they can convince others that they are telling the truth is horrible. And in Hollow Water, this was also an approach that fragmented a community that had already been torn apart by decades of residential schools, forced displacement, systemic poverty, and racism. Hollow Water residents revived their traditional form of addressing harm and violence called the healing circle. And this healing circle, unlike the court process, which might be backlogged by taking years to get to court, but a trial might take anywhere from like 2 days to 2 weeks and won't necessarily drag on and on and on. Their community holistic circle healing was a lengthy process. And the example I'm going to give, again, has mentions of sexual violence. There was one couple who had 5 children, and they had sexually abused 2 of their 5 children. And for them, the healing circle took several years. All of their children had been removed to foster care outside of Hollow Water. And only after the couple had participated in both the healing circle as well as individual counseling for 2 years were the children moved to foster care homes within the community. So they weren't given back to their parents, but they could start slowly moving back to their home community. And there they began participating in family counseling sessions with their parents. So they still lived outside the homes, their parents' home, but they could begin talking about what had happened and how to heal. And one of the daughters, during a family counseling session, said, "I could trust my dad being alone with him. I couldn't trust him before. We sit down and talk about what he'd done. He keeps telling us over and over how sorry he is. We've come a long way." Now ask yourselves, what might have happened had Grisha's family been able to access a program like this during her childhood? What if there had been a program available that would have offered counseling and support for families experiencing violence, where people are taken out of immediate harm's way with the goal of helping the family heal so that they could, if they felt it was safe and if they wanted to, reunite again. But there was no such program in Warren, Ohio, or if there was, no one knew about it to refer her family to it. So we ended up instead with Grisha taking the action that she did, killing her father, and then being criminalized and threatened with a lifetime of incarceration for this. Closer to home in Vermont, there was a program called Stop It Now, which provided support for people who had committed child sexual abuse. The program existed for 4 years. Instead of taking a punitive approach, it utilized a public health approach similar to campaigns against drunk driving. Through both media and public outreach, Stop It Now provided information on how to recognize and address child sexual abuse, demystifying it, because we often think that we would automatically know who was somebody capable of sexually abusing or abusing a child. They must have, they must be green and terrible looking, and we would automatically spot them. It wouldn't necessarily be, our neighbor or our, beloved aunt or uncle or, a teacher at a child's school or a daycare worker or a sibling. So knowing how to recognize and address child sexual abuse and knowing that it could be somebody that you knew did what goes a long way towards being able to address and stop it. And at the same time, the organization provided resources and encouragement to those who are abusing a child to seek help in stopping their abuse. The state's juvenile justice system also sponsored a pre-sentencing alternative program for adolescents and children who had perpetrated sexually abusive acts. And between 1995 and 1999, over 100 people, nearly all of whom were adolescents, voluntarily came forward for help with sexually abusive behaviors and acts. Think about that. Over 100 people, nearly all of whom were under the age of 18, came forward for help. And again, what if such a program had been available when Grisha's father was a younger man? What might have happened then? What if such a program were available now? What might happen to prevent and to help stop child sexual abuse? However, despite these successes, Stop It Now was only able to continue for 5 years before a lack of funding forced its closure in 2004. There are some other ways to address violence, including gender violence. And these you should think of as blueprints, not as exact recipes or maps as to how to get there. So they are ways in which people have tried to do things, and with varying amounts of success. But what we do know is that prisons do not necessarily create success in stopping or addressing gender violence. Transformative justice refers to a community process similar to restorative justice that addresses not only the needs of the person who was harmed and the person who did the harm, but also the conditions that enabled this harm. In other words, instead of looking at a harmful or violent action in a vacuum, transformative justice processes also ask, what else needs to change so that this never happens again? And what needs to happen so that the survivor can heal? There's not necessarily any right or wrong set of footprints to follow in transformative justice. And instead, each process depends on the people and the circumstances and the supports available to them. One strategy within transformative justice is community accountability. And I'm going to take from the definition offered by Insight, Women and Trans People of Color Against Violence. Community accountability is a community-based strategy rather than a police and prison-based strategy to address violence within communities. Community accountability is a process in which a community, and that can be a group of friends, a family, a church or other house of worship, a workplace, an apartment complex, a neighborhood, a classroom, etc., work together to address a community member's abusive behavior, creating a process for them to account for their actions and transform their behavior, while also working with the survivor to address their needs. Community accountability also examines the conditions that enabled and encouraged this harmful behavior, and also encourages them to help change these conditions. And this is not just the onus put on the person who did the harm, but on the entire community. So this could be, for instance, and I don't know how much this has made news or has stayed in the news in Maine, but for instance, we have heard since the start of the coronavirus pandemic about an uptick in street violence against Asians and Asian American people. And under a carceral approach, we would say we need more police, we need to arrest more people, and we need to throw them in jail so that they will be off the streets, and Asians and Asian American people, particularly those who are most targeted for violence, like elders and women, can stay safe. Restorative justice might say we need to take the person who was harmed and the person who did the harm and sit them together and have them figure out what needs to happen so that the person who was harmed can begin to heal. And it might be that the person who did the harm, has to help pay for their therapy. It might be that the person who caused the harm agrees to go to anger management or agrees to go to anti-racism trainings. It might be that the person who was harmed says, these are the things that I realized helped enable you to do this type of violence. Like every time you get drunk, you end up causing harm to somebody, or you end up being belligerent, and I happen to be walking down the street that day. So we need to address your drinking, or you need to address your drinking. And then if you look at transformative justice, it would take that and then also say, what are the other conditions in this community and in this society that enable and encourage this harmful behavior? So it might be, who are the people who are encouraging violence against Asians and Asian Americans because people are frustrated that we are in a never-ending pandemic, and there are not enough. There are not enough conditions to be able to keep people safe, and people are being forced to work in jobs that are not safe, or maybe they're losing their jobs, or maybe they've been really economically hard hit because they did not qualify for unemployment benefits when their job shut down as part of the pandemic. And to say, how do we then address this so that way violence doesn't keep happening as people misdirect their anger about mismanaging of the pandemic onto the Asian and Asian American population. And that might be trying to figure out how do we address these frustrations in our communities and encourage people to not target other people. And it might also be that people understand that there are, there's a lack of mental health treatment. So people who previously were able to get mental health treatment someplace could no longer do so, and therefore were acting more violently and erratically. That could be another condition that has changed. So community accountability and transformative justice also does that. So if you look at the ways in which community transformative justice and community accountability work together, we can see that these have the potential to address harm and potentially stop future violence in ways that policing, prosecution, and prisons often promises to do, but fails to do so. And a couple of notes is that community accountability cannot be coerced. You cannot force someone to take responsibility or accountability. If any of you have toddlers, obstreperous spouses, or very stubborn siblings or family members, you know that sometimes you cannot force someone to take responsibility or accountability. But oftentimes when you have a relationship with somebody, you can say like, hey, you really hurt me. Like, what are you going to do about this? But what we also have to keep in mind is that our current system of courts and imprisonment does not encourage a person to take responsibility for their actions, let alone try to repair some of the harms they have done. So if we're thinking that we need a one-to-one system of replacing policing, prosecution, and prisons with another system, then we are always going to set ourselves up for failure. But if we say, how can we start chipping away and addressing and preventing conditions that cause sexual harm, sexual violence, sexual abuse, and other types of harm and violence, then we can say, like, what are the other tools that we might utilize and that we might strengthen in our communities? And with that, thank you so much for listening. And I think we can open it up to questions if folks have any.
Thank you so much, Victoria. That was so deeply grounding and informative in the ways that we both can begin, I think, to pick apart a framework like carceral feminism and understand the violences it enacts and continues to enact right across all of these structures and systems of policing, of policymaking, of the prison and jail system. And then so wonderful to end, as you did, thinking more particularly about the ways we can imagine restorative and transformative justice practices. We have a number of questions that have come in. So I want to start, as folks have been asking their questions, picking up sort of where you ended, thinking about restorative and transformative justice systems, or processes, I should say. And so this question asks, how does restorative justice work when there is resistance by those who have been harmed?
Yes. Well, I think that's an excellent question, because it is not necessarily like you have to mandate that people do a restorative justice program. Here in New York City, there is a program called Common Justice, which is actually used by prosecutors and courts, or like rather, let me rephrase that. It is independent of the criminal court system, but prosecutors and courts can agree to send people facing charges for crimes of violence to Common Justice to do a restorative justice program if the person or persons they have harmed agree to do so. And so what ends up happening is a prosecutor might say, like, hey, I've got these people on my docket. Or a defense attorney might say, hey, this is, a good candidate for Common Justice. Here is a 22-year-old that robbed somebody with a gun, but rather than charging him with armed robbery which in New York, there's a mandatory 3 or 5 year sentence for gun possession or illegal gun possession, plus whatever the robbery charge is, plus having a criminal record, plus going to prison, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What can we do to make sure this doesn't happen again? But also what can we do, to make sure that this gets addressed? And the first step is the facilitators from Common Justice go to the person or persons who have been harmed and say, would you want to participate in a restorative justice process? And they explain what it is. They explain, like, basically you would go and for a year or a year and a half, you would meet separately. So the way Common Justice works, and every restorative justice process is different, is that they work separately with the person or persons who have been harmed. So they have a team of people who can work with them around, accessing therapy, accessing, other mental health needs, figuring out like what kind of medical needs do you have, if you have any, like what other needs have arisen from this harm. And then there's another group of people that work with the person who did the harm to be like, what is this root? Like, what made you do this? And often, Common Justice founder Danielle Serid says, people don't come to violence for the first time by perpetrating it. I think I mangled her quote, but basically understanding like, where did this violence come from? Because people don't start by picking up a gun and shooting somebody. Like, that's not the first time that they've encountered violence. It is always because violence has been done unto them, and really helping them figure that out and dig deep into that. So that by the time they come together, the harmed person and the person who did the harm, there's the person who has been harmed is in a better place, perhaps mentally and emotionally. It's not like, oh, you just got mugged and 2 days later you're going to go see the person who mugged you. And then the person who has done the violence isn't like, I didn't do it. What are you scared about? I didn't shoot you. I just waved a gun at you. Like they've broken all of that down, which the criminal legal system does not, because you just have this, these two opposing factions that are always adversarial. So the person who did the harm, or the defendant, in the criminal legal system, is encouraged again and again and again to be like, I didn't do it. I didn't do it. It was somebody else. You're mistaken. I didn't do it. But if I did do it, it wasn't as bad as you said, as you're saying it is. And the person who has been harmed is only called up to relive their trauma again and again and again in a way that will convince everybody around them that this happened and it's the worst thing that happened. So they're never encouraged to like move past that trauma, to say like, yes, that happened, but I've been able to rebuild the pieces of my life. And for Common Justice, in about 90% of the cases or 90% of the instances in which they go and they talk to the person who was harmed or the survivor of violence, I've been told that at first the person will just go on a rant, and it's like a verbal vomiting of like how terrible they feel and how they want this person to burn in hell and everything else. And once they get that all out, then they're like, okay, so what is this? And will this mean that this person will never do this to me or to anybody else again? And it's the more practical thing, once you get past the fear and the emotions and everything else that happens when you've been violated, to say like, what can be done? And if you send this person away for 5 years, are they going to come back and continue terrorizing me and other people in the community? Or will they come back more thoughtful, or perhaps with more options or everything else? And so 90% of people agreed to do a restorative justice process, and there's no stick or forcing the 10% of people who are like, let them rot in prison. I don't care. I don't want to be part of this. But it is something that again and again and again, they've seen people wanted to do, even when it wasn't people who they knew or were in community with, but they just said, I don't want somebody else to go through this ever again.
I'm struck hearing you answer this question, and also during your talk, Victoria, not only that, right, restorative or transformative justice processes require this long time frame, right? They require, a year of engaging or addressing or, thinking through the harm one has caused or the harm that one has felt. But they also, and I'm struck by your example from the Ojibwe community, I think, the healing circle, that they also become quite embedded in a particular community's way of working or operating, that in some ways, right, runs quite counter to a legal system that assumes a certain hierarchical approach of sort of uniformity and sameness as it approaches questions of harm or harm reduction or violence. And so just to name that as you've been talking, right, the particular ways that these processes require us to imagine our logics of engaging in very different ways. So we have a lot of questions coming in, so I'm going to dig in to the next question. So this is from Erica. What is your view of reforms that reduce harms in a carceral system? A part of me still believes reforms are not just one thing, they are also harm reduction in a very harmful system. And so where do you draw the lines about harmful versus helpful reforms on the pathway to abolition?
So I draw from Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who is a carceral geographer. Those of you who don't know what carceral geography is, she basically made up that field. Like she created this field in which basically she looked at how prisons and carceral, like the carceral apparatus has basically changed the geography of the United States and the world. But she talks about non-reformist reforms. So if we look at reforms, like a criminal justice reform, we should ask ourselves, what does this reform do? Does this expand the prison system in some way, shape, or form? Does it give more teeth to the carceral apparatus? And is something we're going to have to fight to tear back down later? Or is it something that chips away at the prison system and enables some group of people to get what they need, when they need it? So for example, I forget how many states now have laws that prohibit the shackling of pregnant people while they are incarcerated, particularly during childbirth and delivery. So for those of you who don't know what shackling is, it is when, if you ever see those movies about chain gangs or the coffle during slavery, it's when you take handcuffs and you handcuff somebody and you have a chain and it goes from the chain to a belly. There's a chain that attaches to a belly chain. Those of you who ride bicycles, if you ride bicycles in Maine and have bike chains, it's about that heavy. And then there's another chain that attaches to your feet, which are also cuffed together. And up until 1999, there were no laws in any state that said thou shalt not shackle pregnant people while they are in labor, delivery, or right after they give birth, if they are in jail or prison. So you can't say, well, let's wait until this day in which we can not have pregnant people be incarcerated, because people are pregnant and they are going to give birth when they are due, or a little sooner or later. But, you can't say like, oh, come one day, there will be this. But a non-reformist reform says, thou shalt not shackle, period. This person is not going to get up in the midst of labor, overpower two guards, jump out a window and run away and escape. That's just not going to happen. So what we can do to make, life a little bearable and to be more humane is to say, we cannot shackle pregnant people. Another example, but an example of a reform that might expand the prison system might say like, well, there are a number of people who are pregnant while incarcerated. So we should build a whole new prison or jail for them, instead of saying like, how can we reduce the number of pregnant people that enter our jail and prison? It might be that we, like the state or the jurisdiction reduces, bail for people who are pregnant. It might say like, we're no longer locking people up for these types of charges, so that way we don't have people who are incarcerated while pregnant. It might be that they say like, okay, we're going to like look for other types of support services that people can access while they're pregnant, so that they don't end up in jail or prison while they are pregnant. So reform that would expand the carceral system might be, we're going to build a jail just for pregnant people, and that's where everybody goes. Or similarly, now that the prison population is aging because of all of the laws passed in the 1980s and 1990s mandating either decades-long sentences or life without parole sentences, a non-reformist reform might say, like, how do we start letting people out so they can spend their last years at home with their families, or say in a nursing home if they don't have families, but they're not spending it shackled and chained to a bed with only an armed guard looking at them. Or how do, so that might be a non-reformist reform to say, like, how do we do this? In Connecticut, there was an initiative that worked, that basically a nursing home was basically I forget what the word is, like basically like you take over an existing nursing home specifically for aging people who are incarcerated that no longer pose a threat to society, but also, did not have anywhere to go. So rather than keeping them in prison to say, like, well, you've outlived all of your friends and family, so therefore you have no place to go, they said, like, we have a nursing home that is not barbed wire, bars, armed security guards. Basically, you are, in a nursing home like any other older person would be in a nursing home, and this would be, like where you are, kind of permanently paroled to until you die, but, like a way to get people out of prison, rather than saying we're going to build a geriatric nursing home inside a prison, which would then just cement the carceral system even more.
Yeah, thank you. That was so helpful. And I hope our questioner, Erica, also found that an illuminating answer. So I think our next question, is picks up on the same conversation. Do you think that electing reformist prosecutors or prosecutors who self-identify as abolitionists moves us towards abolition? Or are these prosecutors really just part of the carceral system, even while ameliorating its harms? What is the potential for actual transformation offered by abolitionist prosecutors?
I think that you can't really have an abolitionist prosecutor. That the term is an oxymoron, but electing people who are not zealous, gung-ho, I want to lock everybody up, prosecutors is a form of harm reduction. So maybe looking at it as like baby steps towards abolition. So, like having people in San Francisco, the people of San Francisco elected Kesa Boudin as their prosecutor. And he ran as a progressive prosecutor, a reform prosecutor, not as an abolitionist prosecutor, but he did say that he was not going to try to lock people up for petty crimes. He did start implementing reforms in which the prosecutor's office no longer kept going after people for basically minor stupid things that prosecutors' offices often go for. So when looking at whether or not to elect a progressive prosecutor, I think that should not be the end all be all where we're like, yes, we got Kesa Boudin in San Francisco and Larry Kramer in Philadelphia, Larry Krasner in Philadelphia, and Rachel Rollins in Massachusetts, and we're good. But to say like, okay, this is a form of harm reduction, because obviously prosecutors' job is to prosecute. So they are going to do that. But what if we could have prosecutors who are like, this is a waste of my resources to continue to prosecute people for these types of nonviolent drug offenses. A friend of mine yesterday was telling me she was put on a grand jury. New York recently legalized marijuana. She was put on a grand jury pre-legalization of marijuana, where the prosecutor was so intent on prosecuting marijuana possession. And when it was obvious that the 12 or 14 people on the grand jury were not on board with it, she yelled at them and said, it is not your job to vote on how you feel about the law. This is the law, you have to indict. And apparently she was so abrasive that the entire grand jury just refused to indict a single marijuana possession case. So if you had a prosecutor that said, we're not even going to be bothering with this, don't arrest people for marijuana possession because we will not prosecute. Don't target predominantly young Black and brown kids, for marijuana stops, and arrests, and pull them away from their families, make them spend the night in the precinct, and then drag them to court. Like, this is also just massively disruptive. If you have prosecutors that just say, nope, we're not going to do that. We're not going to be that woman yelling at the grand jury about why aren't they indicting lots of kids for low-level marijuana possession. That's a step towards harm reduction, So again, it's not the end all be all, but it could say, like, you know what, that might be a dozen fewer cases that never needed to be in court in the first place, that never needed to have a kid, whisked off the street away from their home and their parents and everything else to be upended for, 1 to 3 nights.
I'm going to combine our next two questions. So the first is it possible to chip away at abolition by beginning with abolition for children, then for women, or is it an all or nothing situation? And then I'll tack on an additional question from an audience member. Do you actually see an abolitionist future for the United States?
Yes, and yes, and yes. Okay, so, so if we think about abolition, I mean, in the 1800s, people thought the abolition of slavery was just bananas. They were just like, this is just like this weird pie in the sky dream. Nobody really thinks that this will happen. The best we can do is, like, we have some states do this and some states do that. And maybe we eliminate these terrible practices, but we still have the reality of chattel slavery. And now we no longer have this reality of chattel slavery. I recently reread something by Ursula K. Le Guin that said, the divine right of kings once was thought to be just a reality that you could not change. And that is extremely not the case now in the majority of the world. We do not have this idea about the divine right of kings. So yes, do I think that abolition in the United States would be possible in my lifetime? Most likely not, but I can chip away towards that future I want to imagine, and what I would want my grandchildren and great-grandchildren to be able to pursue, because not simply because I want to have a world in which I don't want to worry about them being policed or criminalized, but also abolition is not necessarily just you take away all the jails and prisons and everybody runs free and we live in Mad Max world, where too bad, so sad for you if you don't have like weird gadgets to defend yourself. But what do we need to have in place for people to survive and thrive? What do we need to have where people can not only access the resources that they need to survive, but also to say, like, what, everybody gets to participate in these activities that right now we only think of as activities for people who have money or who have resources. Everybody can go enjoy art. Everybody can go enjoy music or, something else that, right now might cost you money or might involve leisure time that you don't have. Everybody can have like some sort of, respite from caregiving duties, whether it's, caring for a child or caring for an elderly parent or caring for another family member. Like, and it's not just people who have a lot of money can have nannies or, at-home caregivers, and everybody else is just working themselves to the bone and is miserable. So if we look at abolition like that, we could say, like, yes, it's probably not possible in the US in any of our lifetimes, unless we have a 3-month-old in the audience. And even then they would have to be pretty old, when they see abolition happen. But how can we work towards this? So not necessarily just no jails and prisons, but how do we make a society in which we don't need jails and prisons to address all of these needs we're no longer addressing? And then I think we can also work towards abolition when we say, like, how can we, if you work around children's issues, how do you combine that with abolition to say, like, what, we don't want to send children to juvenile jails. We don't want police to be the go-to solution when kids get into a fight. Like in New York City now, there's like this zero tolerance for kids getting into fights. So kids will get into a physical fight, which, like we all see those movies in the 1950s and 1960s where kids get into fights and Nobody gets hauled off to jail overnight. You get into a fist fight and that's the end of it. You know, somebody gets a black eye and a busted up lip, or, you know, some bruises, but it's not, the police come and drag everybody off to jail and charge them with assault. So it might be like, how do we do that? Because that's a way to chip away at this expanding carceral system. Or if you work around women's issues, or you're like, I want to work specifically around women's issues, you could say, how do I chip away at this? You know, how do I, you know, either work with incarcerated women or work with women who have been criminalized, or how do I even address things like gender violence and developing ways in which, you know, we can prevent gender-based violence? Like, what are the problems that are facing our community now, and how do we also address them? It might be like, hey, you know what would be good? You know, better lighting along college campuses at night, you know, like, so that way there aren't dark places where, you know, a sexual assault might happen. When I was in London, in the women's bathroom in pubs, they would have these big signs on the back of the door that said, like, is your Tinder date not who you expected? Are you feeling uncomfortable? Just go to the bar and ask for Angela. And you would go to the bar and ask for Angela. And that was a signal to the staff that you needed help and they needed to help you get away safely. You know, like, what are ways in which we can practice this kind of everyday abolition? So it's not like, this person is kind of creepy, but they haven't broken a law that is on the books. You know, there's no law that says you cannot be a creepy Tinder date. You know, there's, you know, but there is something that like triggers somebody's like, oh, this is not safe and this could lead to more violence, or this could lead to violence. So what are ways in which we can practice that sense of safety?
I love that, practicing everyday abolition. And it reminds me, in one of my classes a few weeks ago, we were reading about decolonization, right? And also that formulation of decolonization as, on the one hand, right, not something that will happen in our lifetimes, but can become a daily practice of solidarity, of community building, of compassion, of care, of continually challenging, of imagining differently and enacting differently from, right, these systems that are so interrelated, right, to form structures of oppression or social violence. So I think we have one more question, which might draw us back in some ways to our conversation around restorative justice. And so Stephanie asks, it sounds like a great deal of responsibility on the part of the person who is harmed in restorative or transformative justice practices. An investment in the healing, which we know is long-term. And so I think maybe the question there is, what are the stakes of assigning or imagining seemingly, right, this responsibility on the one who has been harmed? How do we negotiate, or how do we make sense of the need for that responsibility to be taken on?
I think, again, it could be like what do you need? You know, like, what do you need to start healing and even thinking about this? Because, you know, like, when somebody is, I mean, if you think about any time you've been in some sort of emergency or crisis mode, you're not necessarily thinking right away. You're just like, you know, like, oh my God, you know, like, this terrible thing happened or is happening or is about to happen. And you're not thinking like, what do I need? You know, this is why, like, there are so many like mindfulness practices that are like, slow down, you know, stop and count to 10, or stop and count to 5, or stop and count to something and breathe. So I think that part of it is, you know, like, addressing them, like asking what they need and kind of like letting them say like, I need this, because they might be like, oh my God, I have to go get my kids, you know, like, and, you know, my mom needs to be taken to, you know, to dialysis, and this other thing needs to happen, and my rent is due. And, you know, so there might be a whole cacophony of things that are just heightened by being in crisis. So I might say like, okay, well, what do you need? Okay, maybe you need somebody to hang out with your rambunctious toddlers for a little bit, so that you don't have to constantly be, you know, on them and making sure they're not like, you know, drawing all over the walls and, you know, like pulling all the snacks out of the cupboard and throwing them on the floor. It's like, okay, maybe this is what you need right now. It's just, you need a little bit of space to breathe and think, you know, and just to be. you know, and then you might say, then the person might say like, oh, this is actually kind of like what I'm thinking I need, you know, like I really need somebody to talk to about what happened to me, or I really need somebody to, you know, get me, you know, to this medical appointment, or somebody to help navigate, you know, how do I get access to the things that I need? How do I get access to counseling? Or how do I get an appointment with the blah, blah, blah doctor, you know, because of the violence that I've suffered? Or this person, you know, wrecked my car. How do I fill out all these insurance paperwork, you know, to be able to like get my car fixed so that I can go from point A to point B? So I think it is, you know, not just you have to sit in a circle and, you know, be part of this restorative justice process, but also what do you need, you know, in order to begin healing? And people have all sorts of different answers once they are able to kind of see past this binary of you can either have police and prisons or you can have nothing, you know. But if we give people more options, people then can envision what are the options that best suit what I need for myself and for my loved ones in my life. And one other thing is that I didn't mention this in my talk, but there's a group called the Bay Area Transformative Justice Collective, which does something called pod mapping, which when we talk about everyday abolition is a really, you know, useful tool because it happens before any crisis happens. So you think about, so pod mapping is this thing where basically you think about who are the people in your life that you would call on for help and what kinds of help. Not just like, here are my 5 best friends, but your 5 best friends are all super flaky and they will not actually, you know, be there for you. But it's like, oh, you know, this friend over here is somebody who I could turn to if I needed somebody, a shoulder to cry on. This person over here has a car, and if I needed to get from point A to point B, they're always willing to drive me. This person over here has a car, but they're always drunk. So no, I don't want to, you know, to have them drive me, but they might, you know, Venmo me $30 so that way I can, you know, call an Uber or whatever and get home. You know, this person over here, you know, might run to the grocery store for me if I'm unable to do so. And then also, who are the people that can hold you accountable when you hurt somebody else? Because I mean, all of this talk is focused on, you know, people who've committed sexual harm and, you know, other types of gender-based violence, but we all harm people on a daily basis. So who are the people who could be like, hey, you know, you said you would do X, Y, or Z. Like you said you would pick up mom, you know, and take her to the doctor, and you didn't. And that meant that, you know, somebody else had to rejuggle their schedule, or she didn't go to the doctor that day. Like, you know, somebody who would then hold you accountable for the ways in which you fail to show up. And Mia Mingus of the Bay Area Transformative Justice Collective calls it, it's like, she made a basketball comparison, which I'm going to mangle, but like, you know, basically like they don't get to like do their 3-point layups or whatever right away. Like they just practice and practice and practice. So if you practice that kind of like asking for help, but also being open to being accountable, like you continually grow it. So we don't start with the like, you know, how do you stop a rape or how do you stop an assault, but also like, how do we, you know, make ourselves accountable so that we know how to act when something happens or can act to help stop something from happening. So it's sort of like, you know, how can you be accountable for some egregious harm if you live in a house with other people and you constantly fail to do your dishes? So if we think about abolition as like sort of like growing those types of relationships as well, not just we all hang out and we go to the bar, we all hang out and go to the coffee shop, but also like, how do we grow our relationships so that way we say like, what else, you know, can we show up for each other?
Yeah, I'm reminded, I think maybe your work in the Alphabet City in the Lower East Side maybe started in this space, Victoria, thinking through, right, the practices of community building or solidarity building that happen in these quotidian and everyday ways, that as we build a foundation for caring for each other in those ways, it becomes possible to build that foundation upwards into a structure that, right, might be that abolitionist future for the US that the 3-month-old in the audience might see by the time they're 95.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much, Victoria. This was Such a wonderful talk. I so appreciate, we all so appreciate the expertise and the compassion and the knowledge you've shared out with us. And we so appreciate your work and your writing on these topics. So thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Yes, thank you everyone for joining, for staying, for all your thoughtful questions. I really appreciate it, even if we couldn't be in person yet, to actually have a full-on discussion. But hopefully next time.
Indeed, hopefully next time, yes. Have a lovely evening, and thank you all for joining us this evening.